Hi, my name's Mr. Professor Nick Hobson, and today I'll be talking to you about a soon-to-be-published paper entitled When Novel Rituals Impact Intergroup Bias, Evidence from Economic Gain and Neurophysiology. So we had a couple goals for this study. The first goal was to create novel rituals in order to demonstrate the causality, the causal impact of rituals on intergroup bias and intergroup dynamics. And to do this, we actually needed to maximize the ritual aspect while minimizing the group interaction aspect in order to properly verify this causal impact of rituals on intergroup bias. So that was the first goal. The second goal was to determine which features exactly contributed or garnered this intergroup bias. We found across the 4 experiments, we found 2 features of ritual might impact this: effort and repetition or time. And we found that we considered that these 2 features would actually mediate intergroup bias. And so in the experiments to follow, we manipulated and varied these 2 features of novel rituals, namely elaborateness and repetition. Yes, and that's what we did. So we know from past work, anthropological and game theoretical research, it has suggested that rituals actually are a bulwark against large group cooperation, and they allow for mass cooperation within growing groups, and it helps to fix the free rider problem within these groups. They do this because rituals serve as a credible public signal or an advertisement of a person's inner beliefs and intentions. So essentially, if a person is willing to engage in these effortful and onerous ritual behaviors, then it is a credible signal that they are in fact loyal and prove their allegiance to the group. So it was important for us across the 4 experiments to not use the actual term ritual in the manipulation when we were exposing participants to the various manipulations. And the reason for that is because the term ritual actually has its own sort of connotation, its built-in meaning behind it. And so if you were to tell people engage in this ritual, then they would have some sort of preconceived notions that that the ritual ought to do something for them. In this case, it ought to affect their group interaction in the lab. And so we wanted to minimize that as much as possible. And so in order to do that, we took out the word ritual, and instead, in its place, we used action sequences. And so it was important that we hit on that point for all the experiments. As far as operationalizing the actual action sequences, or here what stood for ritual, we used sequences that involved repeated actions that were sort of formal and set in time and space, and also importantly that had no direct causal link to the desired outcome in this case.
For the first experiment conducted in the study, there was a final sample of 100 students at UTSC. They all received $10 for their participation. They were randomly assigned to a ritual condition or a no-ritual condition, and both groups underwent a minimal group manipulation. The experiment composed of an at-home portion that lasted a week and a final in-lab portion. At the beginning of the at-home portion, both conditions estimated a number of dots in a series of images like a minimal group paradigm. The estimates from the dot counting sessions were used to a week later in the lab determine the minimal groups based on underestimators and overestimators. In the ritual condition, participants learned and memorized a set of 2-minute-long action sequences that were highly repetitive, and the sequence movements had clear start and end times. They were told that the actions were part of an ancient cultural practice over the course of the week. Participants in the no-ritual condition completed filler questions related to cognitive processing for the same amount of time. They did action sequences that were short, simple, and less demanding. The action sequences had to be completed 3 out of the 7 days. After 1 week, the participants had their final in-lab testing session. When the participants arrived at the lab, they were put into groups of 4 that included 3 participants and 1 confederate. They were told it was a group experiment for group variable manipulation, and the experimenter informed participants that their data from their dot counting estimate session showed them to be underestimators, thus assigning them to the red group. They were assigned at this point in time to minimize group experience among themselves. This way, they did not have the chance to interact with their group members as a collective group. The out group were overestimators and were placed in the blue group, however there was no blue group. Those in the ritual condition performed action sequences one final time. They lined up beside one another facing a wall so that they could see themselves somewhat. Timing of the actions were staggered by 10 seconds to prevent participants from coordinating with one another and controlling any effect of synchrony. Those in the no ritual condition spent the same 2 minutes completing another round of dot counting in their own groups. This was to control for group salience and time. The assumption was that all participants would have their identity validated equally. Headshots of each participant were taken, and they were informed that each person's picture would be uploaded to the main computer, but only the images of the Confederates were used. Participants then completed multiple rounds of the trust game. The trust game is an economic game assessing social preferences. There are 2 rounds of the game where participants interact with the member of their in-group and out-group separately on a computer. The picture they saw on the computer screen of the in-group or out-group member was always a picture of Confederates. The game is essentially such that player 1, who is in the sender role, sends player 2, who is in the receiver role, all of the $10. If all of the $10 was sent, this would get tripled when player 2 received it. In the second exchange, player 2 is given the option to reciprocate the offer and send any amount of the $30 back to player 1. In a cooperative exchange in which player 1 trusts player 2, they would send the entire $10 to fairly reciprocate the offer, thereby signaling their trustworthiness. Player 2 would then reciprocate by splitting the $30 up, so $15 to each player. Overall, there is a more risk of endowment being lost if you chose to send more money to player 2. The participants needed to treat the task as an economic exchange with real consequences, so they were told individual outcomes from each interaction would be added and averaged, and this is the money they took home. But since there is no real player 2, the participants across both conditions took $10 regardless of their decision.
For the second experiment conducted in the study, there was a final sample of 90 students at UTSC. 20 students were male, 59 students were female, and 4 were unreported. The students received course credit with the possibility to earn additional money for their participation. They were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions: an elaborate ritual condition, simple ritual condition, and a control no ritual condition. It composed of an at-home portion that lasted a week and a final in-lab testing session. The experiments began in the presence of both in-group and out-group members, and the experiment's action sequences were framed as vague and neutral as possible. Participants were informed that the experiment was related to physical movement and its effects on cognitive processing. The participants were to perform the sequences without any preconceived notion of ritual, including any reference to ancient cultural practices. The actions that they performed in the elaborate ritual and the simple ritual conditions were made up of the same ritual-like features similar to Experiment 1. They varied in the level of complexity and length. The simple ritual sequences were shorter with less rules and guidelines and involved less repetition. The elaborate ritual sequences were longer and more involved with strict rules and also utilized coins and water as ritual instruments. The at-home portion and the in-lab portion were similar to Experiment 1. After that, the participants completed a series of rounds of the trust game. There were 4 interactions, 2 in-group Confederate interactions and 2 out-group Confederate interactions. For the third experiment conducted in the study, there was a final sample of 123 students at UTSC. They received course credit with the possibility to earn additional money for their participation. The participants were randomly assigned to a ritual condition or a no ritual control condition. Unlike experiments 1 and 2, there was no at-home portion. The ritual participants performed during their one and only lab visit. The participants were assigned to minimal groups. The participants then performed the action sequences. Each participant followed along the instructions of sequence steps, which were printed on a piece of paper on the wall. The participants in the no ritual control condition spent the same 2 minutes completing a round of personality items. They finished with 4 rounds of the trust game.
Finally, the fourth experiment in this study focused on 2 event-related potentials, the feedback-related negativity and the feedback P300. The feedback-related negativity is a negative going waveform occurring between 200 to 300 milliseconds after the occurrence of punishing and rewarding feedback. The feedback P300 emerges between 200 and 500 milliseconds after receiving feedback and often codes a representation of feedback or reward magnitude. Increased FP300 represents increased attention to motivationally salient stimuli in the environment. In this experiment, there were a total of 50 students that participated. They completed the at-home portion of the experiment and were then randomly assigned to two conditions, an elaborate ritual condition or a no ritual condition. During the in-lab portion, the participants and one confederate were assigned to the red group, which was the in-group, and two confederates were assigned to the blue group, which was the out-group. The experimenter then told the group that there was only enough time for one person to complete the EEG, and the name would be randomly drawn to determine the person for each case. Participants in the elaborate ritual condition performed the ritual in the lab, whereas the ones in the no ritual condition completed the dot counting manipulation for the same amount of time. The design was a 2 by 2 by 2 design. So there was one category of ritual, which could be elaborate ritual or no ritual, another category for group, which could be in-group or out-group, and finally the last category of outcome, which could be reward or punishment. In this experiment, we used continuous EEG to measure participants' event-related potentials while 1. Receiving feedback on a task and 2. While observing in-group and out-group members receiving similar feedback. One of the participants was hooked up for EEG while sometimes performing the cognitive or perceptual timing task, and other times they would observe others perform the task as well. A time estimation task was used to provide feedback to the participants. The participants looked at a central fixation cross which was presented for 250 milliseconds for each trial, followed by a blank screen, and participants were instructed to press the spacebar when they thought exactly 1 second had passed. Thus, the feedback was provided after 1 second. The participant had completed a total of 20 practice trials for this. When the participants were in the performer role, they were told that the more correct responses they provide, the more bonus pay they would earn. While in observer role, their task was to pay close attention to the feedback being given to the performer. To ensure the observers are engaged, they were tested intermittently with the question, "Was the last trial you observed correct or incorrect?" Participants received either a reward, which was that they won money, or received a punishment, which was that they lost the money, if they didn't provide feedback within the predefined time window that they were given. Unknown to the participants, the window was decreased after a correct response and increased after an incorrect response. As a result, the occurrence of rewarding and punishing stimuli was roughly equal in each performance and observer block.
There were 4 experiments that were conducted in this study. For the first experiment, we focused on the behavioral measure of economic trust to garner intergroup bias. For the second experiment, we focused on the level of elaboration and effort of 2 features of rituals affecting bias. In the third experiment, we focused on the pre-register experiment, which was completed in a lab. It is about the impact of minimal form of novel ritual with barely any repetitions and time on bias. In the last experiment conducted in the study, we tried to find neural responses that correlates with a particular behavior or response that is associated with rituals on intergroup bias. Novel rituals influence neural processing related to evaluations of others, suggesting how rituals may influence intergroup bias.